Alrighty, we are going to do a little review on compound inequalities. Compound inequalities are two inequalities that have been smooshed together to create one big inequality, which means when they are written like this, you will notice my two inequality symbols. That means I should end up with two answers. Now, we've learned how to do this two different ways. We're going to go over the way where we split them apart. So, splitting them apart involves using this middle part two different times. First equation would split here, right before that inequality, and take all this information over here. So I have -1 is less than or equal to -6v minus 7. There's my first inequality. My second inequality starts at the end of this first inequality and takes everything to this side. So -6v minus 7 is less than 5. So if you take a look at these, here's my first time I use my middle, there's the second time I use my middle. Once I get here, I solve it just like I would any other inequality. Draw my line. Circle what I'm solving for. How do I get rid of a -7? I have to add it to both sides. That's 0. Bring down my -6v. Bring down my inequality symbol, and -1 plus 7 is a +6. From here, circle what I'm solving for. What do you notice is inside that circle? That's right, it's a -6 times v. So to undo that, I have to divide by a -6. Now the only trick with inequalities is when you divide by a negative, this little inequality symbol is actually going to flip. So you see how it reads 6 is less than? It's actually going to flip now and become a greater than. Let's see. Divide by -6, divide by -6, and I have v, my sign flips to a -1. Come back over here, circle what I'm solving for, draw my line. How do I get rid of that -7? The same way I did on the other side. You'll find that you end up doing the same thing twice. So I'm going to add 7, add 7. So I have -6v, that's a 0, less than 12. Since I'm dividing by a -6, my sign is going to flip from a less than to a greater than. Divide by -6, divide by -6. 12 divided by -6 is a -2. -6 and -6 make a +1, which is what we're looking for, so I'm left with v. So then if I were to smush these back together, because I can, I can make them look like -1 is greater than or equal to v, but since I already have v written, I don't need to write it again. I just write the inequality with the -2. To graph, since this is my ending and this was my beginning, I should have a barbell looking figure on my graph. Okay, I put my first dot at -1. Now it's a filled in dot because of that guy right there. So I fill it in. I go to my -2. It is an open dot because there's no line underneath that one. And I connect them. And they look like that. Gorgeous, right? On your paper, let's take a look at number 3. We just did number 1. Now we're going to take a look at number 3. Number 3 says -3r plus 6 is greater than -15, or 6 plus 9r is greater than or equal to 96. Now, the key word to this is this or right here. This tells me that my graph should end up looking like this. So as long as I can get the right answer, I really don't have to worry about which way my arrows are going, because I know they're going to go away from one another. I don't need to split them apart because they're already separated by the or, so I just need to solve them. So I begin with drawing my line, circling what I'm solving for. And remember, once you do that, it's just like another equation. You move everything else around by adding or subtracting. So my positive 6, that's right here, I get rid of by subtracting 6 from both sides. This zeros, I bring down my negative 3r. I bring down my inequality because it hasn't changed. Negative 15 minus 6 is a minus 21. Circle what I'm solving for. I notice on the inside of my circle, my r is actually a negative 3, which means when I divide, I have to flip my sign. I will no longer be greater than. I'm going to become less than. So divide by negative 3, divide by negative 3, and I have r is going to be less than 7. So on my number line, and my 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 6, 5. Okay. I put my circle at, not 6, at 7. And it says it's less than, which means I have to go this direction. If you're unsure on which way your arrow goes, let's plot our other plot because we know we'll move away from its dot. Draw my line, circle what I'm solving for. How do I get rid of that positive 6? I subtract 6 from both sides. So I have 9r greater than or equal to 90. Circle, divide by 9. Since I'm not dividing by a negative, that just becomes a 1, and I bring down my r. My sign does not flip because I did not multiply or divide by a negative, and 90 divided by 9 is 10, which means I go to 10, put my circle in there. Greater than is that way. But again, as long as you know they're going to move away from one another, you really, really, really only need to know that ors look like this, and you're golden. All right, we're going to also look at number 7 on your worksheet for today. Number 7 says negative a minus 10 less than or equal to negative 11, or negative 6a minus 2 is greater than or equal to 34. So we're looking at an or graph, so we should walk like an Egyptian with the arrows pointing opposite directions. I don't need to split anything up because they're already split up, so let's just begin. Every time I should see you draw your line and circle what you're solving for. How do I undo a negative 10? I add 10. So I have negative a is less than or equal to negative 11 plus 10. My signs are different, so I subtract my numbers. 11 minus 10 is 1, and take the sign of my negative. I cannot leave it as a negative a. So I have to divide by negative 1, which means that my inequality in the middle is going to flip. I'm no longer less than, I become greater than or equal to a positive 1. I look to my next one, draw my line, circle my inequality, look to the other number there. It's a negative 2. It can't stay as a negative 2, so I must add 2 to both sides. 34 plus 2 is 36. Bring down my inequality sign. Negative 2 plus 2 is 0. And I have negative 6a left on this side. Still in my circle. Now, since I have a negative in my circle, I know my inequality is going to flip, so I'm going to go ahead and write it as it flipped. So it's no longer greater than, it becomes less than. So the alligator is no longer eating the a, it's actually close to the a. Divide by negative 6, divide by negative 6. This equals 0, or 1, and I'm left with a. 36 divided by negative 6 is a negative 6. Which means when I go to graph, I put my first dot, a is greater than negative 1, right, or positive 1, right there, and it's filled in. My second dot goes at negative 6, and it too is filled in. And since I know it's an OR equation, my arrows have no choice but to go like this. We are going to do one more. We are going to do number 6. So on your paper, take a look at number 6. I have negative 34 less than or equal to 2 minus 4x, which is less than negative 6. There's 2 different ways to solve this. Number 1 is splitting them up. So negative 34 is less than or equal to 2 minus 4x. And then split it up this way. 2 minus 4x is less than negative 6. Draw your line. Circle what I'm solving for. How do I undo that 2 there? Well, it's a positive 2, so I have to subtract 2 from both sides. 34 minus negative 34 minus 2 is a negative 36. My inequality is still the same. And my negative 4x. Since it's a negative, my inequality is going to flip. So divide by negative 4, divided by negative 4, and x becomes less than or equal to 9. Same actions over here. I'm going to start with subtracting 2 from both sides. So I end up with negative 4x in my circle. Again, my sign hasn't flipped yet. And negative 6 minus 2 is negative 8. Divide by negative 4, divide by negative 4. I divided by a negative, so my sign flips to a greater than 2. Which means I go through, I can smush these 2 inequalities together. I have 9 is greater than or equal to x. And then since I already have my x written, I can ignore this x and just put my greater than 2. So then here, 2, 9, I'm not going to fill in all the other numbers. But I know, since it's an AND equation, I have a filled in circle on the 9 because of that line right there. I have an open circle on the 2, and then they're going to connect and look like that. Okay, you have 4 other problems left on this page to work on. Please work on them. Let me know if you have any questions.